In this episode, we investigate how publishing can happen online or in digital formats. We will introduce the characteristics of digital publishing and discuss various formats such as ebooks and interactive PDFs, with a primary focus on websites. We will also consider how digital publications can be a viable form of presenting and disseminating artistic content and research, while sharing more about the key considerations in making and maintaining a digital publication. The episode features a conversation with Joella Kiu from Object Lessons Space and how it runs and exists as an online publication. The key learning points for this episode are: what are the characteristics of digital publications? Why might one choose to publish digitally? What are some things to keep in mind when initiating a digital publication? Art publishing in the era of the digital. Broadly speaking, digital publications are accessible and hosted on the internet or on any electronic devices. Most commonly, they refer to websites, but can also encompass other forms of media such as ebooks and PDFs. These formats are typically long-form and made and presented specifically for viewing on electronic devices. Art publications in the form of a website can also be framed as a platform that consolidates and shares a variety of knowledge with a specific focus. These are three broad types of digital publications and their characteristics. E-publications that are read on devices such as a Kindle, smartphones, or a tablet. These are usually distributed as EPUB and MOBI files. Ebooks are suitable for largely text-based works with a priority towards reading text accessibly. While most ebook platforms allow for the reading experience to be specifically tailored to each reader, with functionalities such as font size adjustments, clickable footnotes, and content pages, as well as search and highlighting functions, there is no guarantee that images or uniquely formatted texts within an ebook will be standardized across all devices. For the PDF format, the publication more or less mirrors the form of a physical book, with pages that can be accessed, downloaded, and distributed online. These PDFs may be uploaded and read online, viewed as flipbooks on platforms like Yampu or Issuu. With the increased capability of viewing files online and on our mobile devices, we are also able to better access, read, annotate, and download these digital publications across our devices. Interactive PDFs offer functions such as clicking on links, playing videos, or jumping between pages. Websites can be accessed on any desktop or mobile devices. They are hosted on a variety of web hosting platforms such as Squarespace and Cargo, or they may be independently developed. Websites are also public in nature and can be accessed as long as there is internet connectivity. Many of us may also be familiar with blogs and other visual content websites, such as Tumblr. These platforms also serve as useful places to kickstart the process of developing a project, or to actually host a finished publication and its various text and multimedia. Other web-based archives, such as Arena, may also work for artists who are looking to gather and consolidate their materials and processes through visual content platforms. Discussion or forum-based projects may also enjoy platforms such as Discord or Slack. Deciding which format would be best suited for your digital publication depends very much on the type of content that you are looking to express. You may think about: how long and dense is your content? How prominent do you want the different elements of your publication to be, whether text or image or other forms of multimedia? Clarifying these questions will help you decide which digital publishing format will best suit your needs. For instance, something that is more text-heavy and may benefit from annotation could do well as an ebook. If images or other forms of multimedia, such as video or audio, are crucial to your project, and if there is an intention to create multiple links to better draw a web of connections, then website platforms may be more suitable for your purposes. It will be important to consider how savvy your target audience is with the internet and digital formats, and how much familiarity your project requires them to have in order to access it. The target demographic will also have a bearing on your chosen mode of presentation and its complexity. Many art writing platforms also feed into an existing context of writing, journalism, and reflection around art, and are part of that unique ecosystem. You will be working fruitfully in tandem with other publication projects that cater to a different focus or audience. This ecosystem also encourages the viability of such publication projects by collectively sustaining audiences, in that audiences for one publication may be easily shared across another. Digital publishing also offers many possibilities in terms of crafting an engaging experience for your reader. Here are some examples of the advantages of working with a digital format. It is mobile-friendly. While print formats are already quite portable, online publications are even more so, and can be accessed on our mobile and laptop devices. Our reliance on our phones and computers for disseminating and receiving information also means that we can easily pivot to these devices for purposes of reading and receiving knowledge too. It helps to cultivate layers and processes. Web-based publications can also cultivate a more process-driven practice, as content can be readily shared online through different stages of your publication's development. It offers unique hypertext interactivity. This also leads us to the point of interactivity through hypertext. Hypertext refers to a text which contains links to other texts, bringing together information or references in a network of connections. The beauty of online content is that almost everything can be linked. One page can lead you to another page and another page. It promotes greater sharing. The ability to connect texts and pages, linking references in the article, or to suggest more linked references at the end of the article, underlines an online publication's compatibility with process-driven and process-informed modes of working. Digital formats allow you to share more and share readily. It allows continuous updating and editing. One of the great benefits of working with a digital format is that it allows for your content to be updated even after it is first published. This is useful for real-time updates to content that can evolve and be elaborated on over a period of time. It is able to present various forms of interaction. For PDFs and websites, video clips, animation, sound and audio clips can also be added to augment the experience of your publication. It reaches a wider audience. The audience for a digital publication is not limited to place or geography. As their interaction is remote, it reaches a wider base of audience, even international, to be slowly cultivated. Finally, it may help to manage your expenditure. While there are costs involved in the setting up of a digital publication, they may be lower than printing a physical book or staging a physical presentation. The running costs of web-based publications typically consist of platform hosting fee, website domain fee, which refers to the name of your website that you usually pay a monthly or annual fee to maintain, V for collaborators, such as website or graphic designers, writers, and other artists. Let's go through some of the key things to keep in mind when making your own digital publication. In our checklist, we start first with the name of the publication. It might seem obvious, but the name of your publication will be one of the first encounters that the viewer or reader will have with your work. The possibilities are endless here, but these are some considerations that could help you decide. Would you prefer for the name to be easily understood without any context? Do you favor something short and catchy, or a longer phrase that might have an acronym? The length of the publication name may also determine how the main visual or logo will look like. Is it part of a series? If so, how does the name express its part in this existing series? If you're looking to start a website, how does the name of your publication translate into your domain? The next thing would also be to configure your role in the publication project. This would help you identify your responsibilities and how you share or distribute other responsibilities with your collaborators, if any. You may take on the role of an editor who conceptualizes a broader theme or framework, plans the editorial calendar, and approaches contributing writers and artists, oversees and commissions various texts, visuals, or multimedia materials, copy edits or adapts these materials for better coherence. If you're working with websites, it would be important to think about web hosting and design. There are two types of websites that you can consider. First, a website built from scratch by a web designer or developer would be a great option for artists who prefer a more customized interface with interactive capabilities. Depending on your familiarity with website design, you may also choose to work with an existing platform such as Cargo, ReadyMag, Squarespace, or Wix that will provide you with a back-end to configure your website and content. These platforms provide an accessible method to create a site for yourself with different pricing plans that correspond to how extensively and easily you can customize the design of your website. Your project can also be hosted on a writing platform such as Medium. Hosting it under an existing platform would limit customization, but it may reduce the possible burden of having to create and design a website when that may not be necessary for your project. The presentation of text is also important to think about when trying to craft an engaging and accessible digital reading experience. Overall, your project text should maintain a certain legibility across desktop and mobile formats, unless it is deliberately meant to be difficult to read. Better legibility can be attained by paying careful attention to your font and font size. This decision affects both the reading function and aesthetic presentation of your site. For longer pieces of writing, you may consider incorporating pull-out quotes that will help present bite-sized takeaways of the writing and pique your reader's curiosity. Similarly, the presentation of different media would also be important to consider. In considering how this media will appear on your website, it would be good to think about some of the following. What relationship do the visuals have to the text? How are the images reflected on desktop and mobile format? What is the scale of the visual in relation to the text? As mentioned earlier, having a mobile-friendly digital publication is a big plus in our current age where mostly everything can be accessed on our mobile devices. A mobile-friendly website features content that is scaled accordingly to the screen sizes. However, there may be instances where a digital publication is more suited to or designed specifically for desktop viewing. Finally, The last thing to consider would be that most digital publications make use of social media or a running newsletter to promote their platform, engage with their audiences, update on various content offerings, or show various behind-the-scenes processes. We will now be moving on to the conversation segment of this episode with Joella Kiu, the founding editor of Object Lesson Space, to speak more about her experiences running an online platform.
Welcome to Art Books, a Beginner's Guide. We're on the episode exploring art books and publications that are presented online or digitally. I'm with Joella, the founding editor of Object Lesson Space, an art historical online platform that documents conversations with artists, writers, and curators. In our conversation later, we will be speaking more about Joella's experience of running the platform and key considerations around the process of online publishing. So without further ado, let's get started. So Joella, can we start first with having you introduce Object Lesson Space?
Yeah, so Object Lesson Space started in 2018. And it's a digital platform and website, www.objectlessons.space. And we publish articles, conversations, and long-form interviews with a wide range of creative practitioners and cultural workers. So this includes artists, writers, curators, researchers, and academics. Over the course of the 2.5 years that we've been in existence, we've managed to speak to a wide host of people who I guess would consider themselves cultural workers and artists, ranging from people who work within the immediate context of Singapore to further afield to Hong Kong, to Taiwan, and even to the United Kingdom. So it's been a really interesting time, I suppose, like being able to speak to all of these different practices, but also to be able to think about them through a central framework, which loosely takes from, as the title of the website suggests, an object lesson. So an object lesson is actually a rather dated Victorian pedagogical tool. So I would say that we haven't taken it full, wholesale, but it's more of something that has been kept at the back of our minds and has been productive in terms of allowing us to think about how people find themselves in networks and the sort of ecologies of works, of texts, of music, of films that they find themselves drawn to or compelled by.
You've already sort of slowly brought us through like how things started and so far what has the content been like. But I think that I also wanted to take the time to maybe focus a little bit about how exactly that Object Lesson Space started, what was the impetus and what were your key motivations, and how do you feel like it has grown since then? Yeah.
Thanks for the question. I think to be honest, there isn't really a neat origin story for the platform. The real answer is that it started off as a shower thought, and so it kind of just grew from there. It was one of the things that just came to my mind whilst mid-shampoo. I was fresh out of university,
Yes.
couple of months into a new job, and I guess on a personal level I was just thinking of a way to bridge what I had grown to love so much with my current responsibilities in the real world. But also I think there's a wider ecological point. At that point in time, we didn't have quite the ecosystem of writing platforms that we do now. And I think when you speak to editors of other online platforms or other publications, they will probably say the same thing in terms of that there was always room for more, and there was always room for more growth as well. So I think we all got it's so interesting that we all got working on planting the seeds of all of our ideas. And I think Object Lesson Space was just one such seed, and we hoped that I hope that it would be able to find a niche in terms of, I guess, amalgamating art historical knowledge, but also long-form text, in-depth conversations, and just the different shapes and forms that a personal encounter with the arts could look like?
The question that always comes out is always a question of sustainability. So that is a question that follows a lot of like art spaces, in terms of like how long can like such endeavors like run. And I think that it also applies also as well to online or digital writing platforms. As we're sort of moving on to that, I wanted to ask you about like, what's the behind the scenes of like running Object Lesson Space. Since you've been running it for 2 years, I think that 2 years obviously, and also the kind of output that you've been consistently the issues have been coming out, I think at least once every 2 months. So with that, I think there's really a chance in which your processes has been refined during those 2 years. My question is, what were some of the things that now that, you might have been useful back then when you've just sort of started things out?
I think like on a very practical level is knowing like exactly what sort of costs are necessary and what are not necessary. So like, I mean, even as simple as like web hosting platforms, like Squarespace, for example, as a web hosting platform can be rather pricey. But in comparison, as a nonprofit, you can apply for a full year free on Cargo Collective.
Yeah.
So these are just some things that I think have on a practical level reduce the barriers to entry for people who think they just want to dip their toes into it, but they're not fully like wanting to commit so far as of yet. Some of the things that I guess have been helpful is also knowing that like it's always going to be a process of growing into or learning more about the sort of things that you want to see or the things that you want to do. And I think for a long time, I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way, is that like sometimes inertia in terms of like, you might have a great idea and you might be sitting on it, but the inertia in terms of like wanting to get it perfect is so high that you just don't end up actually executing it. But for a multitude of reasons, like it's never going to get better if you don't take that first step. So I think it's a lot of like reducing that sort of pressure on oneself to perfect it the first issue out of the gate, for example. And I think those two things, just more in terms of practicality and on a personal growth point, those two things are always something that I think are like two sides of the same coin, and they do help in terms of like pushing somebody forward.
So I think that so many times, I think the analogy that gets thrown out is like, you're sort of thrown into the deep end, whereas I feel like you're always sort of swimming in that deep end with like anything that's self-initiated. With this, I think it also comes like as a sobering kind of realization about something that I've been thinking about, which is whether or not online publications are actually an endeavor that can be self-realized.
I do think it can. But I think like embedded into how I approach this is, I guess a couple of things. A lot of what we tend to think about is the longevity of a project, or like how it will reach people, how many people it will reach, and like 5-year plans, for example, if we're in a place to do so.
Indicator.
Like it's actually a huge KPI as well. It's a huge thing that I've tried to push back against. It's important to think about the fact that nothing needs to last forever, and that in an economy where we're constantly measured by the amount of labor that we put into something, it is also important to know that you are able to withdraw your labor from that situation if it no longer edifies or nourishes you in any way. And I think that it's important to draw those sort of boundaries as well. Having like a clear sense of the fact that one doesn't have to have a project last for all posterity is helpful in self-realizing a project. And the second thing is also setting up your own measures and your own barometers that are external to all of these KPIs that we were talking about earlier.
It then becomes important, I think, what you mentioned about creating that kind of personal measures and that personal kind of barometers in order to be able to, I think, safeguard yourself. We're on the episode of digital and online publications, but I think that obviously there's a saying that goes, whatever that's out there on the internet sort of just stays there forever. And with that, I want to go into the question about possible reasons why you thought that Object Lesson Space as an online platform is something that you were keen on?
I actually spent a lot of my teenage years on LiveJournal, on Tumblr, on Blogger, on Xanga, Friendster. Every single website that you can probably think of that you can have a blog on, I've probably dabbled in it before. I think anybody our age will have this long-standing relationship with the internet where we're all just little children amazed by the fact that you could perform so many different identities on the internet, but also the different sort of communities you could build as a result. And I think in particular a large formative part of my teenage years were LiveJournal communities where people could just hang out. You didn't even know who these people were beyond their username, but you would log on, people would be making mixtapes for one another, making graphics, and just sharing full films on Mediafire and stuff like that. And it was a huge defining part of how I guess I was exposed to things that perhaps I wouldn't otherwise have known about at that point in time. And so I think a lot of those sort of interactions and possibilities are things that I still do carry with myself up till today. And I think that's why I still do think of the website, the internet, in a rather positive light. I do think that, obviously a lot of that has been complicated and there are a lot more nuances to anybody's relationship with the internet now. But largely drawing on a teenage nostalgia, it still holds that kind of sheen for me. And so taking all of that basic HTML, CSS from my Blogspot days, it made more sense to use that in a website format as compared to something that was more print-based, which would require a very different skill set altogether as well. So, I mean, on one hand, it was this personal relationship, and on the other hand, it was also in terms of what I could do by myself. I thought a lot about this conversation that I had with the artist Nor when she was doing her exhibition at Koda Culture 2 years ago. And at that point in time, it was at King George's Avenue on the second floor of a block of shop houses, I think. It was definitely one floor above ground level. And we spoke a lot about, I guess, in terms of accessibility, the fact that if perhaps you were wheelchair bound or you had mobility issues, you might not actually be able to access the space and actually encounter the works that she had in there. And it's obviously something that constantly artistic spaces in terms of galleries or in terms of, smaller independent run spaces have to always reckon with. But there's something about having information or content available online that facilitates this come as you are experience that maybe sometimes in physical spaces for a variety of reasons, social anxiety, mentally just sort of or even just as simple as you have a clash in your schedules, that it's very much, it really sort of frees you up from that to be able to access things when you want to, log out when you want to, come back to it later. The website facilitates that in a way that I still do feel allows for a certain level of engagement in a way that a physical space doesn't. Not that it's better, but it's just that it's an important counterpart.
I wanted to sort of bring us into the actual platform itself, which we haven't, yet started talking about. So, as we've introduced, Object Lesson Space is a platform that's documenting conversations. And so with conversations, I think that lately, I think with the recent issues, they're sort of centered around a particular theme. So I wanted to ask you, how is it that you determine the theme for each issue? And how do you settle on who to reach out to?
It was really interesting to get this question because I think I've never actually really thought about it. So it gave me an opportunity to properly, I suppose, not compartmentalize, but arrange my thought process a little bit better. I think broadly speaking, there are a couple of factors that feed into conceptualizing an issue. Of course, sometimes it's as simple as a conversation from a previous issue piques our interest, and then we decide to expand on that particular area in the form of an entire issue for the next month. So an example of this would be So our current issue is titled On Listening. It's about sound and sound-based art. And one of the artists that we spoke to was Tini Aliman, and her work is incredibly interesting in that it looks at our relationship to nature, and particularly the sort of impression we have in terms of how plants are sessile, like non-moving beings, but actually they have this whole entire secret life of their own that we still have only like brushed the surface of scientifically. And so as a result of that conversation, I've decided to do like a deep dive into our relationship with plants. And so plant sentience, and I guess our ongoing interest in like plant mysticism will be the focus of the upcoming February 2021 issue. Another way in which that happens is also that another way in which we conceptualize an issue is that like we see like an exhibition that was like incredibly compelling, but then we also are thinking about how that will work in a different context, or if we gave artists or curators space to expand on the thoughts that they felt they might not have had the time to do so in the context of like a physical visual exhibition. So I think it always intrigues me that we all find ourselves gravitating towards like similar ideas.
We are like sort of like mapping out these affinities and these greater affinities from like working within like singular units as an artist, and how these practices can actually feed across another practice, even if they've never been in the show before, or they've sort of like, belong to so-called different generations of artists. And I think that is a kind of a way forward, and a way in which you are also sort of calibrating things as you're going on, and looking at your editorial calendar and reflecting on, what could change, or what could be better. With Object Lesson Space, you're thinking about creating a platform for slower, more considered writing. So that question is also, I guess, for me to get you to elaborate more how you're able to create these kind of processes. Yeah,
I mean, it's always a balancing act. Like I do have internal internal deadlines as well. Like if, for example, like we're working collaboratively with an artist or a curator to push out, we want the interview to be launched in time so that people are still able to be directed towards an ongoing exhibition, then there is still like that time-based factor. But I do think that broadly speaking, like at any one point in time, we're always working on 1.5 issues. That's the reality of the situation, is that as soon as work on one issue concludes, it's likely that work on the next has already begun. So it's always a matter of it's always a situation where we're juggling multiple issues at the same time. In terms of like how that feeds into creating a slower, more considered consumption cycle, I think it's mostly a result of having more flexibility with timeframes. Like with a print project, for example, like having to work backwards from like having the final artwork ready and sending off to printers is a huge hurdle in and of itself. And we don't really have that in the context of an online platform.
I appreciate the fact that you sort of mentioned that this timeline is like, obviously there is an internal kind of timeline that's determined by when the exhibition closes, or like whether a project is ending, or when the issue is coming out, for instance. But I think that these timelines are always like collectively calibrated to give enough space for both parties to, to figure things out. I think I've always sort of experienced and engaged Object Lesson Space as like a long form interview platform. And I wanted you to share a little bit more about the decision on focusing on the long form interview format.
I think it allows, in terms of like giving people the space and the time to really expand on some of the things that they are thinking about and some of the things that they're working on. At that point in time, I was also enjoying the work of longer form like interviews in the form of like podcasts, like say, for example, like Krista Tippett's On Being, which are these meandering conversations about life, about philosophy, religion. So I do think that, there's something about being able to follow the trajectory of somebody's conversations that's so incredibly precious and intimate that I thought it would be nice to be able to lean into that in a very conscious way with a long form interview.
With this, I think I wanted to end off by asking you if you have any advice that you want to share for people who are, looking to start their own platform or looking to start their own digital publication.
Just do it, lor. Yeah. Yeah, just do it, lor. Yeah. I think that's about it.
Yeah, especially with what we mentioned about the inertia, right? So do it and then realize also what it takes to keep the doing, right? And then understanding that sometimes we don't have enough to keep doing it for a long term, and then that's totally fine. So I mean, it sounds very fatalistic, but I think that was like a very big takeaway from this conversation.
I think I'm struck by this quote that I'd like to read out in full, that really kind of defines the way in which I think about this. It's a quote from Rebecca Solnit's essay in praise of indirect consequences, which I think really wraps up like our conversation as well. So she writes, "You plant a seed and a tree grows from it. Will there be fruit, shade, habitat for birds, more seeds, a forest, wood to build a cradle or a house? You don't know. A tree can live much longer than you. So will an idea, and sometimes the changes that result from accepting that new idea about what is true or right might just remake the world. You do what you can do, you do your best. What you do does is not up to you."
We don't know what this seed will sprout into, we don't know what kind of tree that it will sprout into. And I think that we in a culture so defined by like profit and by capital and by this kind of like results, we might want to be a little bit less attached to this kind of results. It doesn't mean that we don't approach things with intention, but it just means that we are focused on processes, right, than so much about creating something that will last forever. And I think with that, we've sort of come to the end of the conversation. Thank you everyone for taking the time to tune in, and thank you so much, Joella, for spending the afternoon on your side with me. And I think with this, we can bid everyone bye.
Thank you for watching this episode of Art Books, A Beginner's Guide. If you have enjoyed this series, we would also appreciate it if you can fill in a feedback form that can be accessed through the QR code or link. We have also compiled a list of titles or texts that have been referenced or consulted on in the episode for your reading pleasure. See you next time.